Hey there, welcome to this episode of the Cutting Room Floor. This is a segment that I take you a little bit deeper into something connected to a recent message here at Sunny Slope, something that maybe we just didn't have the time to get fully into. It's kind of like following a rabbit trail, and so we get to explore something a little bit more. This past week here at Sunny Slope, we heard a message on the idea of what it means to be made male and female and to be made in the image of God. And those ideas are really the sort of the key components of what it means to be human. Now, one of the things that has cropped up, especially in the last probably 10 or 15 years, although it has roots that go back quite a lot longer than that, but that's the question and the idea of what is called, it's known today as intersectionality. Sometimes you hear today people talking about critical race theory, and I haven't heard it as much lately, but you hear it when it comes to especially school curriculum, and you'll hear people saying things like, keep CRT out of our schools. In a nutshell, critical race theory and intersectionality are related ideas, and what they have to do with is this idea that all human beings are you kind of get slotted into all these different little characteristics and qualities, really demographic qualities. So, you start with male and female, but then you factor into it race, your racial identity, and then of course there's your sexual orientation and your gender, if you are male, female, or something in between, and it just goes down the line. Now, of course, all these things are true about us. We all have age, you have ethnic background, gender, and so on. But what intersectionality does, and what critical race theory in its purest form often does, is it tries to create a hierarchy of which of those demographics have the most power, and which ones then are the most oppressed. And so depending on people get sort of pigeonholed into all of these different categories. So I am a white male. I would be considered very high up on the power, according to this theory. I would be considered very high up on the power and privilege totem pole. And then if you're, if you add on top of that, if you take a person who's white male and straight, and okay, that gives them more power. But then, of course, there's ways of looking at people who are the oppressed groups. If you are black female, well, that puts you lower on the totem pole of power and privilege. And so what intersectionality tries to do is it creates this hierarchy, it creates this totem pole in a society of who has power and who does not. And so, if you can identify as if you can identify as a person who's very disadvantaged, if you are a socio-economic, you're of low means, and if you're of a racial minority, and if you're a woman, and if you're a same-sex attracted person, and if you're a transgender person, all those things sort of, in one sense, they count against you because they are sort of they mark a power and privilege deficit. In the other sense of it, though, the more marginalized you are, and the less power and privilege you actually have, then the more opportunities you should be given, and the more that you should be afforded special advantages to make up for and to compensate for how society has you lower down on the totem pole. And so you have to then take steps to sort of level the playing field. Now, the problem with this is that, number one, at the end of the day, it doesn't really work, because if you have, it becomes very hard to maintain those categories. So if you have a person who is same-sex attracted, but they're also white and they're male, who has more power? Does that person have more power than a person who's black and same-sex attracted, but they're wealthy? And so, it becomes really hard to maintain all of these different categories. Does a person, if you're a person, maybe to use a different example, if you're a person of a racial minority, and you identify as a same-sex attracted person, but let's say you are a university professor and you make six figures, does that put you higher up than a person who is a person of the majority race and who identifies as a heterosexual person, and so on it goes, and the categories eventually begin to crack and break under their own pressure. And that's why biblically the approach is always to say, how do we understand what it means to be a human? You have to look for the commonality, because, by the way, when you identify people by all the differences that they have, it actually ends up creating more tension and more division. It's a little bit like if you are working in a workplace and human resources decides to put on a seminar or a training that is meant to help you as a workforce all get together better. According to intersectionality, what you would do is you would emphasize all the things that make you different. You would emphasize all the racial differences in gender and sexual attraction and culture and ethnicity, and you would emphasize all of that, and then it would be like you've got to make sure to compensate for the people who are lower down. The functional result of that, the end result of that, is actually you become a very divided workplace. In fact, the more categories that you identify, the more divided you become. Because ultimately everybody is ultimately there's only one person like you who has all this, the qualities of, gender, cultural background, socio-economic background, educational background, all those different things. You start going and the categories become smaller and smaller and smaller until it's a category of one. But you've also now created a sense in which you're creating a totem pole, and everybody's sort of fighting for their place on the pecking order. So you've tried to create a more unified workplace by talking about all these things that are different and how we have people of different places of power and privilege. And in the end, you've actually created a very divided and a very divisive environment. And that's what intersectionality ends up doing. Now, of course, as a little side note, there's always room to talk about how different races throughout history have experienced oppression. That's a valid thing to do. And of course, we should be attentive to the ways that human nature looks at differences and people who are different from us and tends to create tension and conflict. Of course, we should be attentive to that. But you don't build your identity on that. That's the problem. And so what Genesis 1 actually does, the biblical view, the biblical narrative actually says what you have to focus on is not what is different in all of you, but actually what you have in common, which is the image of God. Every human being shares that in common, whether you're white, black, Hispanic, Latin American, Central American, Asian, whatever else you might be. You are made in the image of God, male and female, made in the image of God. That gives you then a grounds and a basis for how we treat one another, which is the second thing that I wanted to point out, and that's that our understanding of Genesis chapter 1 gives us a proper grounding to do justice. So secularism does not have this, because secularism has to answer. Secularism is often calling for us to do justice, to practice justice. But at the end of the day, then what is the grounds for that? What is the grounds for showing compassion to people? What is the real grounds for seeking after racial justice? And I'm not sure that there's a good answer to that, other than it seems like a nice thing to do. Christianity says the reason that you treat people who are different from you, or the reason that you treat even undeserving people with dignity and respect, is because they reflect and they bear the image of God. Now, secularism, I don't think, has an answer for that, or at least not a satisfying answer. Right? Secularism calls for justice, but on what grounds? Why should you treat people who are in prison? Why should you treat criminals? Why should you treat people of different races and backgrounds with respect and with dignity? Perhaps you shouldn't. I mean, if you take that approach, perhaps you should actually marginalize them. Perhaps if you take the view of secularism, then maybe it's better to say that the strong survive, and only the strong survive, and if you're marginalized and you're weak, well, that's actually a good thing for society. See, because you've taken out the grounds and the basis for doing justice. And so Christianity actually offers a better alternative. Christianity says that we are made in the image of God, and that then gives us a reason and a basis for treating people with respect and dignity and pursuing and seeking after justice. Thanks for watching this episode of The Cutting Room Floor. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.